the old way and the new. In the presidential campaign of 1912, Woodrow Wilson attacked the fat cats. He invented the campaign film to help him win the election. But both of his major opponents, Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, shared his feelings about the trusts, personified by the overstuffed capitalist. Gentlemen, owing to the crowded conditions of our hospitals due to the number of injured in your mills, an addition must be made at once. Your contribution in this cause is earnestly solicited. The villain is without charity, especially to his own workers. Gentlemen, we need $1 million to swing 100,000 votes. High tariff boss. In the election of 1912, Wilson and also Roosevelt and Taft attacked the power of the trusts. All three were influenced by the progressive movement, which was battling for reform of the business system. In the decades after the Civil War, America was undergoing tremendous economic growth and change into an industrial society. Big business contributed much to the nation's growth, but the progressives were outraged by the inequities, injustices, and corruption which they felt they discerned in the business system. They aimed for peaceable reform, but at times a violent upheaval seemed more likely. During the Civil War, poverty-stricken mobs took control of New York City. They battled police and militia. They burned and looted for 3 days. Wearing stolen Brooks Brothers finery, they lynched free blacks. They were a drunken mob. A few years later, in the 1877 railroad strikes, rioting and looting raged from Baltimore to San Francisco. Dozens died. Federal troops ringed the Capitol, and out-of-town guardsmen had to put down disturbances in Pittsburgh when the local militia went over to the rioters. Subsequently, the Molly Maguires, the Haymarket Affair, the Pullman strike, and the Homestead strike saw coal miners, railroad workers, and steel workers resort to violence to protest conditions. The rich and well-born prepared for battle. They organized self-defense military groups like the 7th Regiment and built fortresses that they called armories in all of the great cities. When the workers rose in rebellion, the rich felt they would hold out in their armories until the federal troops arrived. Into this developing confrontation stepped the progressives and the muckraking journalists. Between 1890 and 1915, they made the establishment aware of the legitimate grievances of the public. But they also called the protesters down from the barricades by convincing them that the system could and would meet legitimate demands. As they did this, the progressives helped change the image of America to conform to the realities of America. First to go was the agrarian myth. Through the 19th century, Americans thought of themselves as farmers, hardy yeomen tilling a green and growing land, healthy, prosperous, and in tune with both nature and the divine presence. They sent their sons and daughters to one-room schoolhouses, where they learned all that was necessary, the 3 R's and the stories of Horatio Alger. Any poor boy, thrifty and diligent, would prosper. Only the dull, the drunk, and the shiftless would fail. But in the America of 1900, many farmers were failing. They worked as hard as ever, but while they milked their cows, the railroads and banks milked them. The railroads helped hold their crop prices low, and the banks set their interest rates high. Thus, in a good year, the bank took the farmer's money. In a bad year, it took his land. And so an army of farmers fled to the city, not to make a fortune, just to make a living. The cities of 1900 were booming, but they were not exactly as Horatio Alger described them. The muckrakers were far more accurate. The poverty, the filth, the corruption of metropolitan life were exposed in Muckrakers magazines. Lincoln Steffens tore away the hypocrisy which had permitted Americans to imagine their cities as well-governed. He revealed that many mayors and legislators had little respect for anything but a bribe. So Steffens and the muckrakers confronted America's complacent middle class with a harsh reality, and with Boss Tweed's classic question, "What are you going to do about it?" The middle class seemed to answer nervously, "Nothing much." Swelled by immigration, America's urban population grew sevenfold between 1860 and 1910, often packed into foul tenements, some owned by such unlikely slumlords as Trinity Church and the Astor family. They found their playgrounds in garbage-strewn streets and their welfare in a Christmas basket from the political boss. The death rate in the slums of New York was the highest in the Western world. The muckrakers focused the attention of the American people on the foulness of the slums, garbage in the halls and flies everywhere. But they were much more effective when they showed the contamination of the meat served on middle-class dinner tables. Upton Sinclair said that he aimed his book, The Jungle, at the heart of America, but hit its stomach instead. Horrified housewives read that deviled ham was made from tripe, waste ends of beef, potato skins, and beef gullets. Or they discovered that condemned carcasses, flesh filled with deadly poisons, were taken out of the tanks for condemned meat and made into sausages. The final horror was Sinclair's report, that as for the men who work in rooms full of steam, they fall into vats sometimes to be overlooked for days, till all but the bones have gone out to the world as lard. Sinclair's book, because its impact was general, had an almost immediate effect. President Theodore Roosevelt in 1906 successfully pushed through Congress the Pure Food and Drug Act. With Collier's magazine, the leading agitator in the drug area, fake cancer cures, opium-laden drugs, and other quack nostrums were brought under federal regulation and removed from middle-class medicine chests. The slums were the workshops of the poor. Women and children in their tenements did piecework, often the only source of family income. An army of boys filled the streets to sell newspapers or shine shoes. Conditions were equally bad in many factories, but the South suffered the worst ravages of child labor in its cotton mills. 1 of every 4 workers was under 16, and some were only 6. Factory workers generally endured long hours at low pay, and many worked under hazardous conditions.
The boss man jerks them round and round and whistles very keen. I'll tell you what, the factory kids are really treated mean. Our children, they grow up unlearned, no time to go to school. Almost before they have learned to walk, they have learned to spin or spool.
Coal miners suffered too. George Bear, spokesman for the coal industry, proclaimed, "The rights and interests of the laboring man will be protected not by the agitators, but by the Christian men whom God in his infinite wisdom has given the control of the property interests in this country." Under the stewardship of such gentlemen, hundreds of miners were killed or maimed in unsafe mines every year. And of those who survived, few reached the age of 50 unbroken.
Explosion in the St. Paul mine in Cherry, Illinois, where the people were few. The number of deaths totaled 262. 'Twas a cold November day with a hint of rain when a fire broke out in the number 2 vein. A carload of hay caught and started to scorch, and soon the coal mine was a devil's torch. Some lines were found scribbled deep in slate that told the story of the many men's fate. We're all here together in one large camp, dying slowly from effects of black damp. They were Italian, Polish, Lithuanian.
In the steel mills, William Hard charged that production was making steel and killing men. In 1906, 46 men died in the Calumet plant of U.S. Steel. Hard told of worn-out equipment, inadequate safety precautions, and poor medical care. A lug breaks off a pot. A crane operator spills molten metal on a worker. Not until the screams die does the crane operator, Newton Allen, recognize his brother, Horace. March 1911, 146 workers, mostly young girls, died in a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York. The fire doors were locked to keep the girls from wasting time in the ladies' room. Trapped, dozens of the girls leaped 9 floors to their deaths as others perished in the inferno, and the whole world watched. Employer benevolence had been dealt a shattering blow. Politicians, Republican and Democrat alike, often owed their allegiance to financial and industrial moguls. In the larger cities, the machines were frequently dominated by Irish Catholic Democrats. The bosses, even as they grew rich from graft, did some things to alleviate the suffering of their faithful backers. There were city jobs, a kind word in the court, the inevitable Christmas basket. Still, the politicians knew who possessed the real power. Often their chief function was to serve as an intermediary between the trusts from whom they received graft and the worker immigrant whose lot they ameliorated in return for his vote. Tammany Hall was the classic political machine. The outward hoopla, the night parade, the colorful sachems who controlled it did little to conceal its rampant corruption. The muckrakers denounced and caricatured it, but only rarely did they elect a reform ticket. In the end, the voters turned to Tammany. From the master politicians like Boss Croker to the policeman on the beat down to the lowest inspector of weights and measures, each man had his own graft. In New York, the political motto was wampum, wampum, get the wampum, Tammany. Republican bosses made no bones about representing the trusts. Chauncey Depew was the personal representative of William Vanderbilt. He and Nelson W. Aldrich ruled the Senate until the progressives forced the direct election of senators. In the lower house, Uncle Joe Cannon, a rural Illinois congressman, was the speaker. He fought all change so stubbornly that in 1910, insurgent Republicans rebelled, limited his power, and enacted some progressive measures. The muckrakers believed that the trusts owned many politicians. The railroads were the worst offenders. James J. Hill, Edward H. Harriman, J.P. Morgan, and Jacob Schiff were seen as rapacious and greedy, exploiting their workers and extorting unjust profits from their customers, the farmers and the ranchers. Frank Norris, the novelist, called them the octopus. Farmers and ranchers have been seized in the tentacles of this octopus extortionist who makes them pay freight rates imposed like a yoke of iron. The railroads have been the worst offenders, but by 1900, other trusts, which mastered whole industries, were equally grinding. The mother of the trusts was the Standard Oil Company. Ida Tarbell's history of the company reported on the avarice and corruption of John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller was later to become a leading philanthropist, but in building Standard Oil, Ida Tarbell charged he bought legislatures whole, cut prices, and used unscrupulous business practices to destroy competitors. Gaining control of the oil business, he became the richest man of any of the barons of this Gilded Age. Seldom has anyone lived better than a wealthy capitalist of this era. He was close to being totally free to stage million-dollar parties, while farmers were losing their land, while children worked in the factories, while women burned in the Triangle Fire. While the railroads rolled, while the oil gushed, while immigrants festered in their slums, the rich grew richer and richer. So, comes the revolution, comrade? No, comes the election of 1912. In 1912, all three presidential candidates were progressives. Theodore Roosevelt had been president in 1902. He had forced the coal mine owners to settle with the Union. He had stopped Hill and Harriman when they tried to monopolize the Western railroads. He accepted trusts as inevitable, but insisted the federal government regulate them. He denounced Woodrow Wilson's call for the limitations of federal power as the surest way to allow the employer to work his employees to death.
Mr. Wilson's speech today means merely the liberty of the factory owner who crowds his operatives into some crazy death trap on a top floor where if fire starts, the slaughter is immense.
Roosevelt was running as a progressive against the incumbent William Howard Taft. But Taft, too, ran as progressive. He claimed accurately that he had carried out more legal actions against the trust than Roosevelt ever had.
We must take up the abuses in the good old Anglo-Saxon way, adjust our statutory remedies to the fitness of the thing, place our confidence in the public servants who show themselves alive to public need, and courageous and energetic enough to prosecute the offenders to conviction.
Which brings us back to the beginning. Woodrow Wilson's campaign film, starring everybody's favorite villain, the fat capitalist. By 1912, the muckrakers had done their work well. Our villain carried on his back the accumulated sins of 1,000 trusts. He carried with him the stench of the tenements, the nameless miners who had been killed in his mine shafts, the hordes of farmers who had been dispossessed by his sheriffs, the anguished children who had collapsed at his looms, the army of politicians who were on his payroll. He was behind it all. If he could be regulated by law, the world would be a better and a happier place. And so Teddy Roosevelt said, let the federal government control him. And William Howard Taft replied, yes, but I can control them better than Teddy Roosevelt ever did. And Woodrow Wilson added, he's too fat, too big. Let us break him up into 1,000 smaller businessmen. Send me your dollars and I will bring forth the progressive world. For Wilson, too, preached the progressive litany.
The night labor of women and children is abnormal and should be prohibited. We hold that the employment of women over 48 hours per week is abnormal and should be prohibited. We hold the 7-day working week is abnormal. We hold that 1 day of rest in 7 should be provided by law.
Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912. Taft and Roosevelt had split the Republican vote, allowing Wilson to win with barely 40%. He embarked on a moderately progressive course, enacting a stronger antitrust law, setting up the Federal Reserve System and other agencies to improve banking and control business practices. He also implemented the federal income tax and enacted a child labor law, later declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, as well as other measures to improve the condition of labor. But the First World War and its aftermath interrupted the progressive crusade, leaving most of his program unrealized. The Great Depression of the 1930s created another revolutionary situation. It was then that the New Deal turned much of the progressive program into law, finally gaining for the federal government the power to set minimum wages, maximum hours, and abolish child labor. For 30 years, the New Deal reforms helped hold the country together. Even through another war, the nation seemed prosperous. But new problems were building. Much of America's attention was diverted overseas. At home, once again, the barriers go up. For angry young radicals, the villain is the military-industrial complex and its agent, the cop. Students and blacks shout angry slogans and talk about revolution. Blacks burn sections of cities, loot shops, and demand the right to determine their own future. Public leaders call for law and order and fumble with a welter of measures for reform. Again, the question is debated. Is revolution the answer, or is the American system still capable of meeting legitimate demands for change?